Can you hear me well?
Yeah, I can hear you very well. And you?
Yeah. We were talking before. I was just sort of thinking how we can do this chat and, how to use this opportunity to speak to you. And maybe we can also speak a little bit about the work at Not Cancelled. It was interesting towards the process of us selecting the works for Not Cancelled Southeast. We went through a number of works and a number of different compositions, which until we stopped with the group of works that are now shown. And I don't know for you, but I thought it was interesting because our, short discussions on the phone, as short as they were, I thought they were really sort of impulsive and insightful on questions like color and shape and how the group of work will be viewed together and contribute to some sort of between themselves to some sort of effects of stillness and movement and how these sort of formal qualities would be sort of best translated at the end when somebody goes at the website. And because the format is quite specific, it's the grid of 9 by 9, and I thought that was interesting. And talking to you, towards the end of selecting, we went through like 10 variations in 10 minutes. And it seemed like we did so little, but at the end it had such a big impact of, for example, how the left was in comparison to the right and up, down, it's et cetera, et cetera. And I don't know, I just thought it was interesting to deal with this format, seeing that there's so much these virtual spaces that galleries and museums are sort of trying to come up with. I don't know, I thought that was a much more direct, I don't know how to say it.
For me, yeah, for me, what is very interesting in this moment, organizing the online content for Not Cancelled, it's all about that we need to be fast, and we need to be, to be, how to say, like two rappers that are composing their songs and words and rhythms in the in the move on the stage. So it looks like we are almost on the stage and working on our concept for this show, because it's a show. And also it's all about the vision we have, because it won't be, it's not real space, it's imaginary space, but the space of the social media, the space of the website, the space of also the not cancelled platform is a space anyway. No matter if it's virtual or not. And it gives us so much freedom, but in the same time a format. And I really love a word you are using in the title of your work, instant crush. So it's for, yeah, instant crush at the bonus signal. Yeah, so for me it's very bonus, yeah. So for me it's something.
We're showing a few ink drawings which Syria started from the gallery's earlier project, hashtag Sariev self-isolation, and a number of sculptures like the Instant Crash sculptures from the end of last year, the beginning of this year. And together with you and Katrine, we've spoken a little about the work in little fragments in the past month or two. And earlier today, we sort of both agreed that maybe this is a good idea to sort of expand on some of these thought processes behind the work, not so much directly about each individual work, but sort of the things that are kind of constantly in orbit. And in this case, like the title of this talk suggests, it's coming from like this one specific interest and research point of mine, the animation cinema. And I mean, at the end of this sort of talk, we can also talk about each individual work, but we we chose the title of this talk, Material and Media Specificity in Early Animation Cinema, because I will mainly be talking about some examples and writings from this art form and period that have somehow had like a significant impact on what I do in the studio, or very often where my thoughts are, or you know, always relating back to my work process. And but I have to say, in no way would this be, in no way will I present sort of an in-depth breakdown or analysis on early animation, because I can't, and I mean, hopefully in the future I can maybe, but for now I'll just sort of share with you some of these key ideas and methods that somehow examine a certain, how to say, a certain vitality of the animated line, and a rejection, which is an overall rejection of logic, which I find really interesting. A rejection of logic to what a figure or what a shape or what a space can do within its sort of medium limitations. And I will talk about a few other ideas in it, but I just wanted to say quickly, when I was in my early art studies, and you know, I was sort of just trying to get somewhere in the work and in general just figure out what the hell I want from painting, I found it really reinvigorating to look again, let's say, at, for example, early Disneys from the 30s and the 40s, and many Warner Brothers animations, and the Pink Panther, which is from the 60s, which is I'm a huge fan too. And I find it reinvigorating because of, you know, it made me think of certain aspects about painting, and it's to do with its sort of graphic flatness of the canvas, and how such reading contributed to different recordings of the drawing, and of applying a color, or in general sort of how a color is manifested on this flat surface. And all of a sudden, you know, I was thinking about compositions and choreography of that space, which you know, it was something new, and that just came from me literally just binge watching the 120 episodes of Pink Panther from the 60s, which I just had bought, and I just sat through the whole series. And eventually, you know, things started to move away from the canvas, not in a sense to reject it, but in the form of objects and in bigger sculptures, for example, like the few we're showing in Not Cancelled, which for me opened up an interesting thinking space. I don't know how else to describe it, but it's really this space between sculpture and painting, and sort of moving between and around these different modes of process, somehow intensify things. And I don't know how exactly, but in this intensifying, a lot of ideas sort of exploded from this tension that happens from the translation between 2D, 3D, and then again 3D to 2D. And I found there were a lot of things I didn't know about, which sort of just opened up. And you know, talking about these formal translations and yeah, I mean, in general, to talk about painting and sculpture in the same context, I've always find it a little bit sketchy. That's why, yeah. It's
you know what I feel, yeah, in your work, I feel this discussion. It's not discussion about the forms. It's like a surfing through different forms. It's so extreme, and everything is it's mixed in a way. They are stable forms. For example, painting and ceramic and sculpture. But this surfing, it's like you know, you could not see where is that. It's not like a cartoon animation, but it's more like you are having something on paper. How the paper, the cartoon book, can express the movement of the figures of the character. So it's something like a, you know. Yeah, this is what is very intriguing.
And yeah,
because most of the things, they are in the mind of the person that is. looking
Yeah,
into
I mean, you mentioned
art.
animation and surfing and sort of the stable form, which you know, key qualities in sort of animation. And you know, talking about animation, I first came across Sergei Eisenstein's writings on animation in the middle of my BA studies, which for me was just like, you know, a mind opener in London. And it was in one of the color seminars, which the artist David Batchelor, he held in school. So I came across this book called Eisenstein on Disney, and I've tried to give a little overview before, not in an artist talk, but somewhere. And I remember, you know, David, he only had heard of the book. None of us had read it, but it sort of came from a discussion on this sort of interdependency of line and color in painting's history. And, you know, it's sort of often turbulent and problematic relationship that it has in painting's history, you know, the sort of the enclosement of the color with line and so forth and so forth and then so on. So the book, which is sort of the basis of this talk, and the book could be seen as a result of this sort of common fascination about of the animated drawing, as well as their friendship between Sergei Eisenstein and Walt Disney. As in the book, it begins with a relationship between a Russian and American, and this is in the 20s and the 30s of last century. So it's I don't know, it's a really interesting book because it's a little over 100 pages of notes and extended texts that Eisenstein wrote on Disney's early cartoons as he closely followed Disney's every new release. So the book is almost like a diary, and it's composed in this way. It's sort of the chronological order of the date of each text is when it was actually written. So often Eisenstein would write them in between the production of his films. And as you read, it's interesting that the jumps between these segmented thoughts, it's like, because sometimes the texts are separated by a few years in between. And I don't know, I thought that sort of burst of an idea after him seeing an animation is best captured in these gaps. And like I said, they were really good friends, and as I said, they knew each other's work really well. But the works for Disney were really a foundation for Eisenstein to examine one problem, which he called the fundamental problem, which he thought was at the center of the practice and the theory of art. And later these observations influenced a lot of his own work. And as you know, the book method, also these observations sort of fed into the creation of the book method, which is probably like his biggest theoretical work on cinema, and just, yeah, it's really expanded. So for Eisenstein, Disney, and I'm talking about early Disney's, when sort of the late 20s and 30s, he really connected the rational and logic in art and the sensual in art. So for Eisenstein, the cartoons examined the structure of the work, which is in the way it's made in its appearance, the creative act of the work, which is the way it's sort of manifested on the big screen, because in a way that was the biggest creative act, observing the creation of these shapes and figures. And then he examines the process of perception, which, among other things, he takes into account the social and cultural impact these animations had in the States and very quickly worldwide. So for Eisenstein, it's beautiful because he starts the Disney was some sort of a lullaby for the suffering and the unfortunate, he says in the book, and those oppressed and sort of deprived people who he calls were shackled by the big gray wolf of American industrialization. And he compared them to the lost as the sort of multiplied into thousands of car parts on the conveyors of the belts of Ford factories. And he said that one of the biggest effect of this animation was some sort of a social revolt against this sort of he calls oppression. And he says that this revolt, although it was really impactful, was very oblivious because it was temporary. It was almost like a daydream. And the attractiveness of Disney's cartoons was so powerful because they acted, so they were like nothing like in the real world, but they looked like things in the real world, but they acted like nothing in the real world. So it's this sort of weird, weird relationship which had this sort of almost like an ecstasy type of effects to people, and that's why it sort of picked up so quickly. And so I'm just going to go on because I sort of picked up my thought. But on the drawing line and sort of on the animated line, Eisenstein he saw the drawing medium was a very sort of elemental in the stages, what he calls in the stages of coming into being of the human form from the plasmatic form. So in a lot of his texts, he uses this word plasmatic or plasma-like or plasma-formic. And, you know, the idea of the plasma is that it's neither a solid, neither a gas, or neither a liquid state. So it's always like this thing that just exists and is shifting. And so this plasmatic stage for him was the stage of the small, the stage of the microscopic, the not yet developed, and also the abstract. So for him, looking at, for him, the most appealing thing at looking at these animations was exactly that sort of transformative experience. And
Yes.
And he was also a draftsman, so he also made a lot of drawings himself, which was funny because they're beautiful. And I think in the Centre of Pompidou in Metz, there was a show that closed a few months ago, which I missed. I mean, I couldn't go there, but it was a show just based on his drawing. So, you know, the drawing for him was this sort of phenomenon of the detected mobility in an otherwise very, very static form. You know, the form of the drawing on the paper, it's static, but it has sort of this sort of phenomenon on the observer. And he says that this phenomenon happens while the artist is being the prime motivator of the drawing, but at the same time he is also the prime receiver, the observer. So that's like an interesting duality, which you know, just thinking about work and how they're viewed together, and in the exhibition spaces, I've always somehow in one way or another, I've always thought back to it. And it's interesting to know that before Disney ever came, and that was sort of, he started in the mid-20s, there were very few short animated movies. You know, there was Emil Cole's Phantasmagoria from 1908, where he had many hundreds of white chalk drawings on blackboard, and they were sort of composed together. But before Disney, the idea of animation was almost exclusively, it almost exclusively remained within the type of the magical realm. And I say this because before that there were many revolving cylindrical devices and gadgets and mechanisms which were spinning quickly, which was spinning an image which was very often painted on a metal or wooden disc, that when it was spun very quickly, it gave the illusion of this persistence of vision. It gave the illusion of movement. Like devices that, like the phenakistoscope. It's a very funny word. I cannot say it. Yeah. Phenakistoscope. And what is really interesting, because you know the artists and the people who perform these let's say, these happenings were called cinemagicians, which I find beautiful, the word.
Yes, magicians. Yeah,
Uh,
it's amazing.
because exactly, because it had a lot to do with curiosity, it had a lot to do
Yes.
with fantasy because of this sort of optical trick on the audience's eyes, and this is sort of, you know, 19th century, and you have to understand that why it was fascinating is because you observed like a static form having this sort of effects of movement in front of you. I don't know how to say it, but you know, it was sort of people. You couldn't connect the two dots that this thing is stable, it's made out of wood, but then at the same time it gives you these senses that something is like running. You know, the horses are running in front of you. So
But is it, you know, because you are saying, so this magician, the magic is something that is kind of something that you could not see. So this visual representation and making you feel like a plasma, this plasmatic pleasure, if I may say, it is something that is so ridiculous and so so rational, so not realistic, that it's kind of it's a candy. It's something like I don't know, um, placebo for your soul. And the animation is it's this magical world that it's
I mean,
crazy. It's happening.
yeah, I mean, Eisenstein talks a lot about that also. I mean, maybe I'll come back to it, but when I was sort of looking at these devices, I started going way back, and the interesting thing is talking about these sort of self-operated mechanisms. They go back really way back in history. I mean, there are examples from and recordings, you know, from Greek mythology to ancient Greece as you know, measuring devices and recordings of movement of stars and planets. And for example, and often these mechanisms, they have a very beautiful name called automatons, which I find really nice. It's automaton, and very early examples of an automaton, for example, is early robotics. Like you would have a metal doll whose hand or head would sort of would be moved by springs and levers and wheels inside, which all the time mimicked human and animal-like gestures. For example, probably the most famous automaton, which also relatively made it to the masses, or okay, the wealthy masses, was the cuckoo clock.
Yes.
Because, and there's some amazing examples throughout history and cultures from Asia to Europe, but you know, 17th and 18th century. I remember seeing in London when I lived there an example. I forgot where, but it was this almost human-sized clock. It was made out of an ensemble of animals, little figures, and flowers that all of them slightly moved and were shaking, and you know, nothing was really moving around, but it sort of gave this sort of almost like vibrating sense of it, which would give sort of the illusion that you are looking at something, that you're looking at a very complex and independent organism. And they were fascinating because, you know, they gave the sense as if something was operating under its own will. They were fascinating because you know, probably for the first time it was observed in reality, this sort of lifelong fixation of humans, of specifically of some scientists and artists of the times to, you know, bring life into inanimate objects. You know, in a way, this was a sort of a creation of life, and sort of the best example is the story of Pinocchio, that you have, you know, this sort of wooden doll that all of a sudden
Yeah.
receives these human qualities, and that's why many of them were designed after sort of the human body and animal. And I say all of this because thinking about animation, I do really feel that these sort of early automatons were, you know, they fell into the cylindrical devices that sort of were operated by spinning. I do feel like they're one of the earliest examples of animation because no, not because as a sort of this mechanical body, which is somehow injected with like an abstracted idea of a soul. And in this case, the soul could mean motion, like simply as motion. The soul could be motion. And Eisenstein, he talks about this in totemistic beliefs in the book of this sort of body soul plurality. In the context of Disney, if you look at Disney, that would be it happens all the time, the comparison of the human to the animal form, that you would have, for example, human in an image, but then in the form you would be an animal. And very often these animations would sort of play on the difference of levels between content and form. Maybe I'll try and explain it better. For example, in evolutionary terms, which Eisenstein also talks about it, the form is, in the form, the idea of the form, we have the animal, which is a step backwards in relation to the content, which content is the human. For example, a kangaroo is always the professional boxer, or the rabbit is this wise accountant behind the desk, or the fox is is this witty, I don't know, spiteful burglar. And also in animistic beliefs it goes, which is beautiful. And I'm really just sort of scraping ideas because it's a long thing, but the animated cartoon is like this direct embodiment of the method of animism, where you have this momentary supplying of like I said, of life into these inanimate objects. You supply the soul. Best example, the teacups and the candle holders in Beauty and the Beast. They move, they talk, they have feelings. So that's a sort of animism which, it's interesting for me to think about. And sorry, I'm just gonna go. Maybe we can.
No, it's yeah. You're speaking.
Fast forward to the end of 19th century and beginning of 20th. There were many, not many, but there was some animated drawn movies before Eisenstein. For example, J. Stuart Blackton, he made a lot in 1900 and 1906. One is called Humorous Phases of Funny Faces, which is incredible. And I think I remember seeing something made in 1897 or 96 in the UK, a stop motion animation made out of these matchsticks. So the matchsticks were composed in a way that they made like a little character which was drawing on a blackboard. But it's important to know that almost exclusively all of these animations, they remain in a closed circle, or were shown in very small venues in between very small groups of people. So, fast forward again to mid-20s, when the first, the first workings of the Disney as we know it takes place. And one of my favorites, one of my favorite animations from that period is Steamboat Willie from 1928, and everything is on YouTube, by the way. And Steamboat Willie from 28 was Disney's fully realized animated short. It had an incredible impact on culture, not only because it stood from everything else, mainly because it had sound for the first time, but because it was seen, maybe I say because too much, but it was seen as this final push, where sort of it was the final push where the animated picture or the animated figure and landscape and shape was somehow, and color was somehow liberated from the weight coming from these the hardware and the metals and the wood, from these clunky mechanisms that I mentioned before. So in a way, the things that the cinemagicians did and carrying around venues. And it was a liberation, because you have to imagine that in order to experience those early examples of animation, you had to have the person next to it. So you always saw that the person was mechanically spinning this thing, so it moves in front of you. So as a member of the audience, you could never sort of separate the animation part from the influence of the human's direction or the human's hand. And so that really just changed things for the animated cinema. And Steamboat really, like I said, it was the first one that had sort of fully synchronized sound. And as well as the drawing part for Disney, he gave equal, if not higher, focus to sound. And like I said, this animation was like the total synchronization of line and sound. That's why the work really just stood out from everything else, because he understood how much, and I use the word again, how much vitality sound injected into these characters and into these spaces, and he understood that in a way that was sort of the missing part, the missing soul to the body. And I remember reading somewhere him saying that, I don't know, I'm paraphrasing, but in the lines of the sound is the color with the missing pigment, which I thought was another beautiful metaphor for him to describe what sound did to
Yeah.
And around the same time in the USSR, you had obviously the famous Sergei Eisenstein, who was also incredibly experimental with sort of composition and montage of his film, from different camera angles and depths of field, sound and scenography. Like I said, he also did a lot of drawings himself. But what he found most attractive about Disney is this sort of freedom of the freedom of ossification, and that this ossification is sort of the freedom from the hard and solid, let's say, outlines of a form. All of a sudden you had the ability of dynamically assuming any form at will. And in the book he calls this quality of assuming anything, he calls it plasmaticness, which according to him is sort of the quality which allows a being of a definite form, a being which has attained sort of a definite appearance, and which behaves like the primal protoplasm, again, like and not yet sort of possessing a stable form, but sort of capable of assuming any forms, and which, skipping, he calls it skipping along the rungs of the evolutionary ladder, is sort of able to attach itself to any sort of animal, I don't know, living existence. So when I first came across that, again, this idea that you have this unstable form that at its own will can just jump up and down, and at one instant could be like a very complex space, but then on the next instant could be like a little line, for me that was sort of like a eye opener. And he argues that in America in the 20s, 30s, in a country with like a social order with sort of strict, standardized and mechanically measured daily lives, sort of this quality of just becoming anything and everything whenever and however you like was so attractive to people. And in a sense, that was sort of the first American dream, that you can like be anything you like without without sort of going through all these sufferings of life, or and he continues to ask why is this so attractive. And this beautiful part I really find interesting. He says that he suggests that in our human sort of consciousness, or as he says, the viewer's memory, doesn't exist such a stage in his or her entire existence. So, for example, at the site when you have the hand changing into another shape, like the sight of this change brings back the viewers to those sort of primordial stages of existence, you know, the primal stages, or the stages in the fetus, he says, and going further back to the cellular stage. And I'm going to finish maybe with this soon, but lastly, like another important part in the book, which best describes the sort of elasticity of the form or of the figure, which is a beautiful and poetic comparison, which best sort of describes these transformative qualities, is the part where he talks about the image of he talks about the flame, the image of the flame, or the image of the fire, and he says that what else if fire is sort of capable of conveying this dream of flowing diversity in form. And for example, in 1938, you have The Moth and the Flame, which is a 1938 Disney animation. And it's exactly about that. It's a 7-minute long animation just about fire. Fire is the hero, fire is the villain, fire is the one who sort of destroys everything, but at an instant sort of gives birth to everything else. And he goes, you know, further. The fire section is really beautiful, and talks about Chaplin and Arshil Gorky, and he goes to explain the attractiveness of fire, and you know, from pyromania to why it's so attractive to children to begin with, is sort of this qualities of phototropism. Phototropism is when you have the when you are sort of the attracting powers of the bright and strong light. For example, you know, the sun is attractive, the fire is attractive, and he also contributes this attractiveness to thermotropism, which is when which are sort of the magnetic powers of the warmth and the effects they have in cells in our living organism. You know, the comfort when you feel of warmth, for example, in, let's say, cold weather, or and you know, like you were saying in the beginning about the plasma and sort of this thing that serves, and I thought that was right on point, because he also mentions that you know, the rhythmic movement of the fire, and is sort of further amplified. Sort of this attractiveness is further amplified, and he says it has sort of the same intoxicating effects of the human brain. You know, for example, when you're under the influence of alcohol or drugs, while you're sort of continuously staring at this fire. And you know, it's funny to think back about it, because yeah, that actually happens when you see. I mean, now we see fire so rarely, you know, just. But for example, if you have a bonfire, you have like a camp, and you know, that sort of attractiveness of fire, it's so
it's
strong.
Yeah.
And he goes to sort of more religious and philosophical readings of fire, and which I also thought were really beautiful, because he mentions sort of the form of the fire as the burning bush that appears in front of Moses, or this heavenly fire that also appears in front of Buddha. So it's, you know, he really sort of stretches the idea of fire. And also in folkloric tales, to think about it, the fairy tales I've known as a kid, sort of fire is always like somehow a central figure, and fire is always the teller of the future. You know, it's always the teller of one's destiny. Either the character looks into the fire, and so forth and so forth. And
yeah, so it's the symbol of transformation, of going from one shape to another shape, from one use to the other use. So it's all about the genuine help, and it's our tool. Actually, the fire, it's, if we can talk about how we use things, what we do with things, it's not anymore the object of respect or something that we respect, but it's something that we use. So the power, the fire, everything is now in nowadays turned to an energy. And it's how to say, it has own channels. We build the channels for this fire. So yeah, when we talk about the pure fire, it's about the pure idea behind the many things, and it's kind of it's on the same way the protoplasm of everything. So it's something that at the times we are living now, after this pandemic and coronavirus, it's kind of a purifying. We need this purifying fire, and we need to go back to the protoplasm. We need to go back to this, the anima behind the animism. So it's, you know, it's something that when we talk about that's why I like the idea behind comics and animation, because it's so naive, it's so pure representation and idea behind you know, it's we talk about everything. If you read a book about philosophy, it's same, it's fire, plasma and everything, but then Walt Disney make this in other way. It's more playful, it's more understandable, and it's how to say, it's a magical in a way. And yeah, and it also it moves all the other senses. When you talk about the music, it's the same. I mean, you could not separate yeah.
For me, the reason I found it interesting looking at those very early examples of animation is because you could, I don't know how to describe it, but you can feel this sort of this sort of beginning stage of this thing kind of exploding, and you can feel how much artists push the limits of the medium of, let's say, drawing, and because, you know, you also had to do with you know, the idea of the reproduction and this diagrammatic views of the shape and of the color. And it's funny how with the animation, the technical aspect of producing the animation grew almost parallel. And but, you know, to finish with the fire thing, he also says that when we as a society, we learn how to control fire in a way, our sort of this wishful thinking, or our sort of the ability to dream. He says something like this: the ability to dream sort of also was contained because we lost that sort of direct touch with fire. And, you know, you could think about the way your oven works, or, you know, heating up, you know, everything is sort of, that's what I meant. You don't see fire, and when you see fire, it's actually an event. It's usually a bad thing now. And I don't know, I just wanted to end, that's the perfect segue. I wanted to end this fire topic with this section of where Arshil Gorky, I didn't know that, but he had huge observations and writings on fire because he was really fascinated, and which gave me another sort of perspective on his work. It's a short, I just want to read it to you. He says, coming one dark February night to the Oshalsk Square, I saw a frisky foxtail of fire peep out of the garret window and shake itself in the air, speckled with large fluttering snowflakes that fell to earth slowly and willingly. The beauty of fire excites me. It was though some red beast had sprung suddenly out of the moist, tepid darkness into the window under the roof, had arched itself back and was gnawing furiously at something. One could hear a dry crackling as bird's bone crack between one's teeth. as I stood watching the sly artfulness of the fire, I thought, someone ought to go and knock at the windows, wake people up and cry fire. But I felt incapable of moving or shouting. I just stood captivated, watching the quick growth of the flame. The hue of cock's feathers had begun to flash on the edge of the roof. The top branches of the trees in the garden became pink and golden, and the square began to light up. And I don't know, there's many such similar texts of Gorky, and thinking back to the work I've seen of him, and thinking back of all the writings on the flame and so this ever recycling, never ending form in the image of fire, really wanting to go and see his work again. Yeah.
So when you're saying that nowadays we kind of canalize and put in channels, in different channels, this energy that is, let's say, creative flow, because the fire, it's something that we could not organize easily, always in our emotions and passions and so on. So what about art after animation and after fire being, how this exists, how art exists after the fire?
I mean,
or in the fire, or being a fire itself?
I don't know. I mean, it's interesting to think about it, how art exists without the fire. I mean, I think there's always fire. I recently spoke to a good, great artist and friend of mine, Alonso Velarde, and we always ended up talking about this sort of process of finding something in painting. Like whenever talking about painting, you're always like, oh yeah, well, it's a process of finding and sort of opening up yourself to vulnerability and sort of observing these changes. And I think that's a sort of a fire, because you're just sort of letting go something go out of control almost. Like if you let fire go out of control, it could turn into either something maybe catastrophic or something incredibly beautiful. It depends in the context of the fire. But I don't know. I mean, fire, the art without the fire. I don't know. It's, I don't know, to think back to my studio and sort of I don't know, okay, let's use this sort of metaphor of the fire as the process. I do feel sort of the studio is the real center of my, thought process. I say this because, there's always like a circle of things, like, I don't know, parts of unfinished sculptures or a puddle of paint that is always left from the canvas I was just working on. And that is somehow always present in front of me. I don't know how exactly to verbalize it, but it's sort of a feeling, this presence of these random shapes and color masses somehow excites me. It excites connections that it excites connections between the works, like like fast firing nerves. You don't see it, but you somehow observe it. And very often I find myself in these quick bursts in the creative act, where I just make a lot of things. I make, and then I take a nap on the sofa. I wake up and then I can only see it. So that could also be just a form of a fire, where
yeah, it's like if I to be honest, I can compare your work with the fire, but mostly with the music. And you put this pigment in the music to become a color. So it's really connected to a jazz, to how to be to improvisation. And so I can imagine you being in your studio, so you make drawings and you go and you make some sculptures and then painting and going into in between these works.
I was maybe we should end with this. I don't know how long we are, but I recently saw a nice documentary on Netflix on Miles Davis, and what really stuck with me, how accepting he was to make new things, and talking about jazz especially. He always traveled with a group of musicians that were his sort of quartet, or like little group of musicians, that everything was very tightly choreographed, sort of in the group. But then within that choreography, he always found room for like the unexpected. And sometimes he would just go on for minutes playing one silent note, and then burst out into another one. And it just made me think how sort of a studio operates, or this my studio operates, is because it's kind of the same way. I mean, it looks like a mess at any one single point, like a bucket has just exploded, but everything is somehow neatly choreographed. So when I feel this urge to like quickly make a decision, I know, for example, okay, the magenta is on the second shelf, and I know I don't need to think about it. I just go get it, and it comes into play. I mean, I know these are sort of rudimental work habits that I know every artist probably has, but just interesting to think about these mechanical processes. And I mean mechanical because they are really mechanical, that sort of feed into the creative act of, I don't know, making a sculpture. Yeah.
Yeah, it has own syntaxes, because I think in this conversation we are giving tools to understand, to people to read your language, from animation, and then to read the dynamic work, the syntaxes, the way you build your visual language, and how it can be I don't know, also about feelings, but understanding. And I think we are giving tools with this conversation. I know it's very spontaneous, and I know it's not real. It's just a Zoom conversation. Because I feel like a zoom in, zoom out, zoom in, zoom out. It's like it's going, it's going deep to the work, and then going back to the history and everything that provoked you. For me personally, it was very interesting to work with you and to select these 9 works that form a grid. And it's all about how to say this, the grid, the grid in the grid where we live in nowadays, and what is our orbit. And sometimes going in this orbit and going in this grid, we are always trying to go out of that. So everything that is out and not present in the in this shape is very intriguing, and it's very very important for me. Of course, we have this zoom in and zoom out also in the works we are presenting, because if you see the images on not cancelled platform, you have very delicate small works, and then big sculptural objects, almost human size sculptures. So it's also, like it's body and the soul, and it's for me quite inspiring, this selection. But you recently started making drawings, so the drawings are the most recent work of you.
Well, I mean, I had done drawings a lot before, but then maybe for 2 years I haven't done any drawings. So we've spoken before about being home on the coffee table, and with hashtag city of self-isolation. So that kind of fired up a lot of thinking going on. And the drawing is funny because it's quick. It almost flows with the same speed of thought. And the only way to catch your thoughts is when you see what you've done at the end. And I often just sort of spread them on the floor. And like I've sent you pictures like once, and you can see my feet because everything is sort of on the floor, and I'm just sort of playing around with them. And I don't know, it's like a mind map. I mean, I don't want to go to psychoanalysis on it, but you see sort of decisions and colors, and I think that's what drawing is best for. I mean, the sort of build up element that the medium of drawing does best is that this sort of self-reflectivity, because painting kind of has a bit of a reverse effect of that, where you're always facing this big field, and I do feel like there's this sort of overview of things in painting, whereas in drawing it kind of starts the opposite way, from like a small line to the overview, whereas from painting is somehow from the overview into the small line. I don't know if that makes sense, but
yeah, absolutely. And now, what is I also always wanted to ask you, looking at these drawings there, because I know 3 cycles of drawings, and there are always these characters. So there, I see their development. Are there any characters, or I don't know, that you can name?
I mean,
because they look like a strange figures, strange characters. They have personality. For me, they have personality.
I mean,
Somehow.
I'm definitely not aiming to sort of give character to whatever shape, but I do think a lot about writing in the same way. There are certain let's say, navigational aspects of your hand that you move when you describe, let's say, a letter, and this comes with language. So by sort of the characters in the language, for example, I mean, the Cyrillic is incredibly beautiful because it has amazing characters as shapes, and me sort of stepping back a little bit, I can sort of appreciate, let's say, the letter J. That's incredible. I love it.
Yeah.
It's like, what the hell? So
here in the video, you should present J.
right, or like J, or But anyway, I'm just saying that no, I'm not. There are recycling shapes which sort of, let's say I work on something 5 times, and the next time it comes out with like an addition or something sticking out. But this sort of, I don't know if you said, this sort of comical character is never intended. It just happens to look like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.